Haere mai te atua I o, te kaihanga, kia tota mai kia tātou I tēnei rā. Kia tai ai a mātou, kia ake tonu. E inui tēnei kia koe, e te atua, kia hu mai kia te mātou, tau nākou aroha. Mō ahe nei, ake nei, ai. We invite you here, God, the creator of all, to be close to us today and gifting to us the possibilities of forever. We ask for your compassion now and in the future, I affirm to you.
Thank you. Thank you, Jane, for opening us up. Everyone, welcome to this week's episode of Hunger for Justice broadcast. I cannot be more excited to be featured here with these two wonderful women and activists. I was fortunate enough to meet Jane, I think about a year ago today, around then. And there hasn't been a moment since that first meeting where I haven't thought about the experiences that we had when we first met. She's the kind of person who sticks with you and stays with you and becomes a North Star or a compass to your direction. I hope every one of us can join today with open hearts and open minds to listen to this wisdom and to honor our ancestors. We're joined today by Janet Mason, whose mother is Indigenous Fijian and whose father is English. Janet is a farmer from Fiji, but lives in both New Zealand and Fiji. Janet practices both public and constitutional law and is a devout activist of human rights. We couldn't be more excited to pass the mic today to such an influential and inspiring human rights defender. Thank you, Janet.
Thank you, Lauren. I'll start off by just talking about this topic and thanking you for inviting us on here. It's a great pleasure to be here. But I have to say that pleasure is coupled with a bit of anxiety about the topic. It's huge. So I've been thinking about this all morning and thinking, what on earth am I going to talk about that's good or that will be useful? And when you think about that, food sovereignty and what food means to us is so important, and it covers everything. So it covers the role of women in society, it covers agriculture and large-scale agriculture and what small-scale farmers have lost. The perspective from someone living in a city is quite different from the perspective from people, Indigenous people, who are living in third world countries, second world countries, first world countries. It's so vast. And Jane and I have worked together on a number of different things. So what we are going to talk through today is just a lot of those different themes. Now, I've worked with Jane for a number of years, and we work across a range of issues. So women's issues, land issues, human rights issues, and this very important topic of food covers all of those things. So before getting into it, I wanted to give a perspective of how broad that is and how we are going to cover all of those different issues. And so I'll pass this over to Jane to introduce herself before we get into each of these issues. So Jane, over to you.
Tēnā koutou katoa. Tōku ingoa ko Jane mihi ngā rangi ruka. Tōku iwi ko waitaha ki te hokianga, nā puhi, nai te rangi nui. My name is Jane Mihingarangi Ruka. I belong to the nation of Waitaha Hokianga, Ngā Puhi, and Ngāi Te Rangi Nui. We have a grandmother's group of which 24 are national and 7 international. Our group of grandmothers are both Māori and other nations. My mountain is Puhanga, my river is Taheke, my marae is Mahuri, my ancestresses are Te Waiaraki and Mahuri. I give you that standing because in Māori culture, you are identified by your location and the lands that you occupy. It's really important for other iwi belonging to other areas that when you meet in marae, you can locate yourselves as to where you belong in Aotearoa. So by stepping and half translating into English, it's allowing both you as the audience to understand that this is an important process for Māori culture. And I'd like to thank A Growing Culture for allowing us this opportunity to air this multi-problematical problems that we have in New Zealand, and Janet will highlight it. We have pinpointed areas of discussion, and Janet will highlight those areas, and I will give you the Māori perspective on them, both ancestrally and to the present day. Janet?
Thank you, Jane. Right, so as I alluded to before, this problem with food and food sovereignty is quite large. It has a whole lot of aspects. And as I overthought my way through this, I kept coming back to one particular thing, and that is the relationship between sovereignty and dependency. And I know that the Western world and Western ways of doing things have benefited human populations greatly. So I don't want to say, don't worry about science. Let's go back to Indigenous ways of doing things. So I think we have to take all of that in. But I then really I kept coming back to food. So I went through, okay, we can look at national statistics, how much arable land is there, where is it, what's wrong with it, why do we have desertification, why are all these things happening, and why do we have so much obesity, why do we have all these things? And when you come back to it, I think that food used to be quite sacred. So we had all these rituals, we had very close family relationships, we worked together, and when we ate food, we did it with a level of respect. It was a communal activity. We didn't just rush around and shove something down our throats while we ate TV because we were all too busy doing something else. And I think that fundamental aspect of food and how we treat our bodies and how we treat each other and how we act communally to produce this food has gone. And I think that with that has gone a whole lot of other things. And those things are about how we plant that food, how we look after the soil, how we relate to the land. And then a lot of these things, of course, were rituals and very much a part of Indigenous cultures. And I know that in New Zealand, that's the case. Māori had many different ways of looking at harvesting, planting, the relationship with food, what they found sacred about putting food into your body. And I know that Fijian society had that. So I wanted to really just explore that aspect of as humans, our relationship with food, what we do with it, what we used to do with it, and what we do with it now that has become so dysfunctional. So Jane, you'll know a bit more about how Māori treated food and planting and the ritual around that. And I would be interested to hear about that.
I'm fortunate enough to be old enough to remember huge gardens and land that you could run around on that had no particular barriers and fences. I think the memory most that I have is running through huge fields of maize and kumara and all the sustainable basic food items that you didn't have to go to the shop to buy. And you didn't have to go and buy white bread because you had kumara. And you had whatever protein that your ancestors could generate out of the oceans. Forgive me. Excuse me. And it was really important that it was a community effort, because by having community gardens, huge gardens, acreages of gardens, everybody felt closely connected to each other, and you celebrated that collecting of that crop by communal eating and communal living, which allowed for people to be independent in that community. And if you particularly wanted to grow something that no one else liked, you found a patch that you could attend to in the time that wasn't allocated to the gardening in the community. And that disappeared out the door very, very quickly. In 1840, when the treaty was signed with the English and the King of England, the royal family there, within 20 years of that signing, legislation practices took, at the signature period, 66 million acres of Māori land was recorded. By the time 20 years down the road, and about 5 or 6 legislative practices took a huge toll on it. On the 66 million acreage, it was down to something like 22 million in that very short space of time. And it wasn't just the land that they disrupted, it was the community existence, because the community living became an unacceptable way for this new settlement process of the colonisation government. It wasn't an accepted way of living, and they made very sure that they took the population away from the land into the city areas so that industry could be used and labour forces could be utilised from the Māori community only. So there was no bringing out the Māoris from the rural areas in order to educate them to a better lifestyle. And the Treaty of Waitangi is the part of, for those of you who don't know New Zealand, we had a declaration signed with the British Crown. And that document was the founding document of New Zealand, which became translated into the Treaty of New Zealand. It doesn't alter the fact that that constitution was a declaration of Māori ownership of New Zealand. So whatever it translated into the treaty, it cannot be superseded. So the New Zealand government does not have a written constitution. We still have the declaration that was signed by Māoridom. So on those notes, I think that's enough of the historical context. I'll give it back to you, Janet.
Yes, I'd like to. I think this is an important point that you made, Jane, because I think that, I don't know, but it appears when you read Western media that people have a view of New Zealand as a very progressive country, as a good international citizen. And of course, we do have a very progressive Prime Minister. She's often featured on global news. She's quite young and she's very competent and very able. But the sad history of the country that she's inherited as Prime Minister has not really been told. So when New Zealand was colonized in 1840, there was a treaty signed, and that treaty wasn't respected or honored, and it actually didn't give the British the right to govern over all of New Zealand and over all Māori. And I don't think that was the intention when it was signed. But shortly thereafter, a whole lot of settlers arrived and they busied themselves with taking Māori land, large tracts of it. The Indigenous people were displaced and they were encouraged to go and set up in the cities so that they could provide labour for the new colony. And then a lot of their lands were taken, a lot of the forests were milled, and that provided the revenue for the establishment of the administration, which then became the New Zealand state. So that is the sad, bad history of New Zealand that to this day is still buried. And that history of New Zealand is not even told in this country, let alone internationally. So while New Zealand has this reputation as a country that has, stood up against nuclear weapons and nuclear ships coming to New Zealand, it has this other dark side. And that dark side, because it hasn't been acknowledged and dealt with, has continued through the generations. And one of the issues that we have been dealing with over the last couple of years has been the state's removal of Indigenous babies when they're born. And this again is a very, very tragic thing. So just getting back to the food thing, I think one of the important points for Māori in New Zealand is that when the land was removed, so of course access to land is quite important when you're talking about food sovereignty. When the vast tracts of their land were taken, then of course that just destroyed their culture. And then as Jane was talking, one of the things that I thought was quite interesting is that we have, because you think, well, what's happened to that land now? What's happening with it? A lot of it was taken for food, but not food in the way that the original owners and inhabitants thought about food, but food in the mechanized Western way, where we all want to run around after what's efficient. So let's just shuffle all of the people who are there off, and let's just turn it into large scale, high producing, high yielding dairy farms, a lot of them are, and let's just put a lot of fertilizer on here. Let's not worry about the long-term effects of that, because look, we are producing 500 units instead of 100, and that must be so great for this country. So that was the thinking, and that still is the thinking now. But in doing that, really, what have they done? They've destroyed a whole culture, a whole way of life, and thousands and thousands of families who used to live very happily on there, depended on that land for their sustainability, for their identity, for many other things. And I think this is a story that has occurred around the world. And so this is this very, very difficult question. And I think it's this relationship between efficiency and producing large scale things, because the idea is that the world needs more food, or it needs more of these, it needs to be redistributed. But the reality is that by creating these large scale ventures, we have lost our connection to food, we've lost our connection to land, and we've lost our connection to each other. And so that's the poverty. Like, we're going for numbers, we're going for efficiency, but there's a poverty of spirit, I think, that we can see in the world today. Jane, you might have a comment on this, but I kind of looked up obesity and I looked up all these other things, and I know that we've got COVID-19, but I think there's like about 10 times more people die, or maybe it's more than that, per annum from obesity than from COVID-19. And I'm not going to be a COVID-19 denier, but just in the context of pandemics, we have got these huge crises internationally, and there seems to be just, there's not many solutions that I see people talking about. And it just seems like so enormous a problem that you really don't know where to start. So Jane, with all of the work that you're doing and what the grandmothers are doing, they must be able to see huge changes, problems that we face now that we never before. And I know that New Zealand has one of the highest teen suicide rates. And I wondered if you'd like to talk about the connections, the linkages between all of those things and food.
I think the original linkages are the loss of a culture and very nearly the loss of language. And that only came back into fore, and a huge fighting to keep it alive by the generation just left, my elders, my mother's age group. Some of my ancestor women fought very furiously to preserve the reo. And as a result of that, we now, opposition, when you have a country that publicizes itself as being advanced in its methods of being generous to Indigenous people. And in actual fact, from the time of the treaty, 1940 to 1975, when the Land March happened in New Zealand, 50 inappropriate legislations were passed in order for us to reach this point where Māoridom woke up that you must have numbers. When you're opposing a person or an organization that controls your very existence, from the moment you are birthed, you have no rights. Like Janet was saying, that they willy-nilly put these laws in place where they can take your children at birth. Now, I have to concede to you, because of the state of poverty of Māori in New Zealand, about going back one generation perhaps, you lost the right to earn your own values in life. And because you've done that, there is nowhere for you to go to get it back, because the system keeps control of everything around you. And while it's smiling into the international forum, you have these discrepancies of the Indigenous tangata whenua. Now, 50 legislative acts brought us to the point where one old granny stood up and said, not one more acreage is going to be taken. And suddenly, Māoridom woke up. We have a way to earn the right to be who we are. So as a result of that, the government became aware, and then even now coming to speak about today, we have all this wonderful communication systems, social media, so they can't keep us without information of each other. And it allows for that cohesion, not just nationally, but internationally, where we're able to reach out to people who have no idea what's going on in each other's countries and the difficulties Indigenous people fight. So I've got a solution to that. I don't believe in standing being a victim. And I think you can either fight in the legal circuits in one forum, but then you must gang together and make your numbers internationally so indivisible by people who want to claim what's yours, that you have the support of an international community in which to back you up, just like the Native Americans did with those oil pipes. Now they're protecting their waterways. New Zealand has the most disgraceful record of pollution. All within 30 odd years, all of our rivers in New Zealand, that you cannot drink out of them, let alone swim in them. They put a level of pollution that they would tolerate. And then the government came back and said, we're going to lower that level of pollution. And when they're talking about pollution, they're talking about the pollutions of excreta, whether it's human or animal, that's the excreta that's in the rivers that used to be pristine. You could go for a mountain hike and drink out of any stream you were walking past. Now you do that at great risk to yourself because all these pollutants, whether it's animal, human or otherwise, are in our rivers. The grandmothers have spent years battling against unnecessary power plants in the rivers, damming up our pristine rivers that are doing no harm to anyone, usually in the mountainous areas where there's not a big populace to fight for them. We're on record as fighting for these rivers. And what do we get? We get concessions because we have agriculture is our GDP only export. So everybody walking around in New Zealand is dependent on that export. But they don't even think about regenerating how they're farming. And I excuse now the last 10 years of regenerative practice. But the damage had already been done by the government's hey-ho and away we go, destroying all of the environment and then allowing permits to mine all these minerals that create more pollutants. So New Zealand is not the clean, green company and country that our government would have you believe. Please do not have that idea in your head. We're happy little campers in New Zealand because we are one of the most devastated countries because we have the heaviest pollutants and don't even talk about carbon. We haven't signed yet into the climate requirements. New Zealand, who's advertising themselves as green and clean, we cannot sign off on the Paris agenda. So then how can they sit and happily smile at the international companies? And if you have devastation at that level, worrying about where the country is going with your children is a very long leap away that unless you're guarding those children, you are going to have devastation being born to you generationally. And this is where we're really at the point of saying enough is enough. And I have to tell you that Janet is leading that battle. She has over 200 cases. And I do not put the blame onto the young ladies who produce these children and then have to have them taken because we have the highest statistics of violence in New Zealand, third in the whole world. 2 other countries are worse than we are. But New Zealand is smiling about clean and green while destruction is happening to our children. And this is not just Māori children, but the statistics prove very firmly that more Māori children are taken out of their families than other nations are. And in order to meet some of those commitments, it's no use New Zealand pretending that we have a good solution to Indigenous problems. I give it to you straight. This country is rotten. And unless we clean up our GDP export quality, we're not going to improve it because it, like Janet says, it has tentacles going everywhere. And food sources suffer the most because we're eating food that are highly galvanized with all sorts of chemicals. And what's wrong with each little family unit growing their own food so they don't have to have these chemical sprayed things put on the supermarket shelves? And how can they do that if they don't have the land to do it on? And better still, they don't own that land anymore that was stolen in the first instance. So don't listen to the blurb that goes out of New Zealand. It's not true. And it's up to my generation of Māoridom to stand up and notify everybody. Do not be the victim of the solution that they present to you. All Indigenous people, do not class yourselves as victims. Stand up and claim what's yours by right of birth and own it, and then fight about it. But first of all, you must own it in your own mind. You could be white, black, or purple, and Indigenous to wherever you are, and that's where you need to start fighting from. And I use the word fighting because they come at you, these big conglomerates, with gentle minds and gentle talk, and they stand people in front of you who are beautiful to communicate with. But while they're having these beautiful conversations, behind the scenes of them, you are being robbed of everything that allows you to stand up and to honor yourself as being a person responsible for yourself. Go out and put yourself on the firing line and claim what's yours. And don't be misled with all the lies that it belongs to another government or it belongs to a corporation. It belongs to you because you are the original people there. And come and meet us, and let's all be Indigenous people of whatever colour and not victims. Janet?
I was going all of the things that Jane has explained. One of the other things about New Zealand is it's very unusual. We don't have a formal written constitution. So what that means is, in terms of constitutional law, which is about power and how it is shared between the various organs of the state. So in regular Western countries, all but 2 of them, you have written constitutions that are entrenched. And what that means is that if Parliament tries to pass a law, you can go to the courts and you can say, this law is contrary to the Constitution, and you can ask the courts to strike that out. So there's a balancing out of this extreme amount of power that Parliament has. In New Zealand, that doesn't happen. So it's all about majority rules and what is often referred to as the tyranny of the majority. So Maori are a minority in that sense. So whenever they make any gains in the courts, Parliament can just, with the stroke of a pen, get rid of that. So Maori had a win in the courts in relation to the foreshore and seabed, and in relation to customary rights and customary title that they might have still in contemporary times in those areas. So the Court of Appeal, which was the highest court at that time, ruled that these may still exist. So Parliament just passed an act and got rid of them. And that's what happens here. So they work in a very, very, very difficult environment. But having said all of that, I just go back to this relationship between efficiency and dependency, really, because that's what's happened. So when we look at what has COVID shown us, and what it has shown us in a lot of different industries is that, yes, we can be quite efficient, yes, we can do all this trading, but we become very dependent on that. So in the small scale communal living and farming and trying to do things differently, we have a lot of independence and we have a lot of self-sufficiency. And as we moved from that into large scale, there's a lot of dependency. And I know that in many places, as soon as COVID hit, people couldn't get the feed for their chickens. So the big poultry farms, the piggeries and all the rest, all of their food was being imported from China. So they got into terrible trouble. And this is what happened in Fiji. In New Zealand, another thing that's problematic with farming and producing food is water shortages. So the freshwater licenses are over allocated already in the South Island. There was a big move for all of the dairy farms to go down there, and that the water has been severely over allocated. So it's very, very difficult to then start farming in that kind of environment. There are local niche type farmers who have picked up on organics and are making some good moves in that direction. But I have to say, overall, for people who are dispossessed, there is very, very little that you can do. People are starting to start communal gardens, but a lot of it is a poverty of spirit. And I think that's really what we see. We don't see a state structure that's set up to assist people to somehow get back their independence in terms of what they feed themselves and what their families feed themselves. I don't think this is just a New Zealand problem. I think this is international. And I kind of started with this idea that when we look at food and our relationship to food, that sanctity of what we're putting in our mouths seems to have gone. All that ritual around communal eating and what we're actually doing when we get together and eat. Well, we don't really get together much anymore. We don't have those rituals anymore. I only see it generally in some families, and mostly Māori families, saying a prayer before they eat, sharing their food, because people just go off to a restaurant. And I think somehow in this modern world, we have lost control of our lives. We have given that up to corporates and other people who influence us through television, through our phones. And sometimes I think that's quite ironic how we build fences to keep intruders out and gates and lock everything up. But we've got so much in terms of a phone getting into the heads of your children and getting into the heads of your family. And I think as a species, I guess today, we have lost a lot of control in terms of what our lives are like. And this is all in this quest for efficiency. And I think that that's really, in thinking about all of this, that's really where I got to. And I'd just like to share with you a little bit my struggles coming from a farm. So I was brought up on a farm, and then I went in to do law. I've returned back to the farm, and that's a bit hard because my time is just so limited. But one of the things that I started doing, and I went back there a couple of years ago, was I thought, well, how are we going to get through this? What am I doing here? And I think these are questions we all face. You know, how is my family being run? What's happening to us all? And so I started working from a set of principles. And one of those principles was that being on the farm and being on the land was about all of us. It was about future generations. It was about food. It was about us interacting communally and rebuilding a family that was not so connected. So we started from there. And I think when we try to grapple with these huge, huge problems, you can overthink them and you can think you want to solve everything. But one place that's quite comforting, I think, is to start from home. What am I doing at home? What am I doing with my food? What am I doing with my children? What am I doing with my friends? What messages am I giving to them? As well as all the business things that you do. So we started with organics. So one of the principles was the land is worthy of respect and care, and the effect of putting so much fertilizer in was just not a good one. The other thing we thought is that we need to cooperate more as a family, so that and this, when I say family, I say whole extended family, that all the different members, we need to meet every week and share food. So that's one thing we did. And then we need to work efficiently. And what does that mean? That means that we need to get rid of wastages. We need to organize and coordinate so that the food that we have is the food that we're producing. We don't need to go and buy a whole lot of these things. And I think when each of us steps back and looks at our lifestyles, there's a lot of wastage, and you can go and Google that, and you can go and see that actually the food that's produced, a vast amount of it is just wasted. And so just taking a look at lifestyles like that and just thinking about really what your needs are. and what things you're being conditioned to think is necessary, but actually it's not. And I think it's a back to basics thing. And I think for the businesses that are doing well in New Zealand and starting to branch out into organics and looking at other ways of doing things, I know that I have a lot of Maori clients who are looking into sustainable practices. They're looking into downsizing, downscaling, and looking at quality of what they're producing, quality of their relationship with the land, and quality with their relationships amongst each other. And I think in this very, very difficult question of food sovereignty and what are we all going to do, that's one of the things that I see across the board people are starting to do, and that's care for themselves much more. And by care, I mean not buying things, but actually delving deeply into who they are and what their needs are, and then saying, well, if I'm going to sell something to someone, I don't want to sell them something that's been poisoned or something that I don't feel proud of. And I think that's a bit of a shift in thinking. But having said that, there are many farmers who are stuck with big loans in New Zealand, who've bought all this irrigation equipment, and that whole wheel that people are on, it's going to be very hard to turn back. And we face that issue with water. New Zealand has got a very, very strong farming lobby, and they don't like, and to be fair, it really would not be nice if you'd been encouraged to go out and get huge loans to buy all this irrigation equipment, and then all of a sudden people are taking away your water quotas and your water licenses. So New Zealand is stuck really on that issue, and unless the government buys them out or provides money for loans, our water situation is not going to get any better. Jane, you'd have some examples of farming up north and things that people are trying to do just to control their environment much more, instead of getting on this, this kind of roller coaster that gets us nowhere.
That's right. And because of this GDP of ours, it impacts back hugely into no matter which way you turn. We all know a GDP looks after everybody. And if COVID has done anything for Māoridom, it's exposed the issue of the level of lack. Now, before we were locked down into level 4, the grandmothers had only just become involved in establishing a charitable trust for the homeless. I live in Auckland, which is the biggest city in New Zealand. And the area I live in is in the West Auckland. And coincidentally, I was made aware of the fact that the homeless are catered for by big organisations. So when I became involved in this issue of homelessness, this is all going back to food and its production and our GDP. On the list of this particular person who is trying to establish coverage of Māori, because in our statistics of homelessness, Māori occupies 70% of the homeless registers. Supplying those people are organisations like Salvation Army and every other, and I'm going to say this word meaning no intention to racism, but every other white organisation, and I say this because Māoris didn't wake up to the fact that they needed an organisation in order to be able to give services paid for by the governmental purse to their Māori homeless. So when I say white, I mean no, absolute no racist slur here. But they are the people who knew and were educated to understand in order to feed the homeless and be eligible for funding from our government, you actually had to have a body set up in which the coffers could be detected whether they were going, the money was being spent on the purpose. So over the last year, because I was made aware of the deficits of the 70% of homeless in New Zealand is Māori. So right up until yesterday, we are now registered to cater to Māoridom, because before the lockdown, we had only probably about 30 to 40 families that we were supplying. Through the process of COVID lockdown, this road rose and covered all of Auckland that required saving, that weren't being touched by the organisations already established. All of them were Māoris and Pacifica, with a handful of European and other nations. 170 different areas were covered for us over the COVID. 700 families were being fed. We went from 30 to 700 in 2 weeks because of the COVID and because of the lack of food supplies, and the government was the only supplier of food in that period because everybody else was made unemployed. So not only did we have now our Maori segment, we inherited the unemployed who, because the Social Development Ministry was flooded by people who were now not earning money. So that it became a generalized mix of needy people requiring food. And where was that food coming from? Most of it from out of New Zealand. So 60 million acres of stolen land is not producing food for its occupants. Now, Janet has just told us how these things can be managed at a family and extended family level, but we had to import food over the COVID in order to feed, and we are only a very small segment of needy in Auckland. We grandmothers are smothered by the needs of everybody, not just Māori now, but the huge number of people unemployed. And what does that show to us? That there is no commitment for futurising safety of food, and food sovereignty in New Zealand does not exist. We're so busy with exporting our milk that we haven't thought about crops and food to establish making ourselves independent. So where should we go now? We should have, and we are going to have, because that's the next branch of this, is supplying the people until they can get back and earn and make their own food. And that's a possibility. Janet's done it in Fiji. We just have to get off the swing of industrialization and all the chemicals that are added to our foods and improper foods that you can buy at McDonald's. Who needs McDonald's when you're starving and there's a patch of garden outside your back door that has kumara in it? Or it's got broccoli. You don't need those huge concepts in order for people to sovereignly survive. And it's a heartfelt issue of mine that we need to centre this, because I'm at the point, and I'm speaking for the Waitaha grandmothers now, when I tell you there are multitudes of really needy families in New Zealand. And yes, the government is supplying boxes. Per family, you get a box that costs the government $80 to load this box with fresh fruit and veg. We're not talking about dried food now. We're talking about fresh food with the possibilities that you may get some protein to go with that. Why are we doing that? We don't have an endless problem of population explosion. We've got countless bits of ground of New Zealand that's not occupied. And instead of going digging that up and producing gold and silver and God knows what other materials, metals, and destroying the forests that surround them, people should be given that land. Don't even worry about buying it. And it doesn't matter if you're white, black, or blue. You should be given a patch of land so that you can manage your food requirements, so that Jane doesn't have to come with a bunch of grannies and bring you a box that's been imported from overseas. Why are we doing this and not making a noise? Thank you, A Growing Culture, for allowing us to speak about this issue internationally, so that everybody who's got problems that have arisen out of this COVID, I welcome this exposure, because now they can't cover it over with media, and a media that only ever speaks to the issues of the people who control it. With the social media, we can talk to each other, and we can tell each other our problems. And we can say, you know, if you've got a square patch of garden out there, summer, winter and autumn, there's plants you can grow to eat. And put some fruit trees in, because you can't go wrong with fruit trees. Every patch of land you've got, grow a fruit tree. It doesn't cost much to get a fruit tree. Preferably get one that is a heritage, so that you don't import genetically modified elements into it. And that's my answer to thank you, COVID, for exposing the lack of sovereignty of foods. Because grandmothers of Waitaha are right in the middle of trying to save 700 families per week for their lack. And all of those families, a majority of them, have 3 and 4 children. My family buckets out in my garage contents that will give the children snacks to take to school. Then on a lucky day, they might get a box of ice cream. So that's something that they understand is a pleasure, and it's not a need to fill your gnawing stomach because you're not getting any food. And let me say that these food collections that the grandmothers attend to are gifts from the supermarkets who are reaching their use-by date. So you have a window of opportunity to probably about 3 to 4 days in which that food reaches its date level. I have my 7-year-old grandchild helping me in my garage to box out added pieces of food that don't come sealed down as the fresh produce. I'm happy for them to learn that other people require these foods. You know, it isn't anything that would have been disclosed to us had not COVID happened. So when you talk to me about sovereignty of food is your back garden. It doesn't have to be more than a patch. It's something. It's not Jane and the grandmothers coming with a box to supply you and endlessly going through that routine when you can manufacture for yourself your own safety. This is my plea to you all internationally. Safeguard yourself and your families as Janet has done with her family. And God help us that the possibilities to do that are left alone and some other country doesn't come and take over yours again, Janet.
Jane, thank you. That's really, really important. And I think that's a really good place for us to start looking at I think some questions have come through. There's some community questions. One of the things that we've got here is someone saying, my perception as a New Zealander living in the USA for the past 4 years is that New Zealand has been quite progressive in the past couple of years about more thoroughly integrating Maori values and culture into decision making. Is this your view, or is it merely more lip service that is being fed to the global audience? And that's a question from Timothy. Timothy, I'm sure Jane has plenty to say on this. I'll just say very briefly that we do a lot of treaty work. And one of the things that occurred last year, and I was so shocked, and we've talked a little about the taking of children. And what was happening with the Child Services Agency was that just any family that someone complained about had drugs or alcohol, and in all the hundreds of cases I've looked at, there was not a single drug test done. And then they would take the police in and all kinds of things and just pick up these little babies. They'd go to the court and get a without notice order, right? So then the other side, so it's sort of like someone accuses you of something and you don't have an opportunity to put forward a defense. So this is what was happening. So, and then they just ambush these families in the hospital. And you can imagine how horrible that would be if you've just had a baby and then all of a sudden it's the police and whoever turn up and take it away. So I was really quite shocked. It was so kind of the 1920s, really. So that there was a documentary made about it by Newsroom, and it actually made CNN News and BBC News. It was a huge problem here. And then that led to 5 different inquiries. So I think that there really wasn't a lot. You've got the Child Services Agency, you know, and a lot of Maori people say our land is important and our children. Those 2 things, without those things being looked after, we have nothing. So there were 3 Maori babies being taken a week, and it really caused a huge kind of national disgrace. And so that, plus I'm involved in a whole lot of things with Jane. She's there alongside all of the work that we do. We support the Waitaha Grandmothers Council, that it is lip service. I think it's starting to change. I think there's been some good news, especially in that child services arena, where the government is now, I think, genuinely talking about devolving those services to a Maori entity, because going back to 40 in the treaty, they had really no right to interfere in that. So Jane, you'd probably be able to answer that question more fully. And so the question is about, has the government being integrated Maori values and culture into decision-making, or is it merely lip service?
Hello, Timothy. A great deal of lip service goes on, as you obviously are aware. I'll give you a very an example that could perhaps define. Up until the TPPA, when it came, the International Trade Organization, and the TPPA was frightening for everybody who had an ounce of sense, in that corporations were going to come and hold you responsible in your state if they didn't make a profit on their investments. In our little New Zealand country, we had hundreds of thousands of people walking around protesting about this, and this is when it first started. Thank God for us, we have some really helpful professional people, academics, who understood this point of law and were very loud about helping the commoners to understand what it really meant for us. Now, our Ministry of Business and Innovation is responsible for notifying the hoi polloi about us, because we were to be informed that this is what our New Zealand government was going to do. They advertised a website on their business, Ministry of Business and Innovation, where you could go to make appointments to see or discuss your issues with this ministry. So I went to it and tried to find that website. It wasn't even on their website, not where they said it was going to be. So I phoned to speak to somebody personally, and the ministerial staff had never heard of it. This is 3 weeks after they had advertised it was possible. This was supposed to be consultation of Māori, so that you could have a voice of opinion to do with this international trade issue. The staff at the ministry had never heard of it. There was no such area to go to for that request. And actually ended up with me having to have a conversation via a solicitor with this ministerial group. And then they ran around like mad things, trying to set up this particular device that they'd advertised, and then tried to put restrictions on how many people they would deal with. After they had admitted that there was no such website, and could they come in, or I could go into the ministry and discuss with them my concerns, I refused point blank and told them they had to come out and meet the rest of my iwi. They put a time limit on it, plus a number of people that they would deal with. And this is when you say, is it just lip service? I go back to the fact that it is no service, never mind about lip. Consultation at this point was absolutely non-existent. And it was because such a furore was made out of it, they then decided they'd better clean up the rest of the ministries. And the Ministry of Trade then started to consult and not to try to put limits on the number of people wanting to converse with them. So as a result of being found out, if I hadn't rung that number, nobody would have been any the wiser that you could not actually have a consultation session with any of the ministries across the board. Now we actually get informed when they're going to make decisions, but where does it lead to? Nowhere, because you have no recourse. They tell you they're consulting you, they're going to negotiate on your behalf, but you don't get to have any say in the matter. Now, another fuss that the grandmothers made with the Ministry of Trade was insisting, and Janet was at this meeting, that we have Māori participation in it. And out of that meeting, they stood a person in, as their organiser, and he chose members in the audience to sit on this body of people representing Māori. So even before we went to have a discussion with participation, they had already come to a conclusion as to how that meeting was going to be organised. And it was pre-arranged that they would elect their patriarchal buddies already set up in business as the representatives for all of Māoridom. Janet had a client who was an elderly Māori man, and he was considered to be too old by other solicitors. A great deal of fuss was made for that, and not one woman was sitting on that chosen panel until I made a fuss about gender equality. And I think that there are 2 people there, but still the majority are men, and all men chosen by the ministerial facilitator. 5 of them. He reached over the heads of the people in the meeting and chose and elected his business buddies, all Māori, but no representation for other areas of Māoridom. So there is a lack, Timothy, and I think that's more than answered the lip service question, unless you have further questions on that. Circular economies. Are you taking that, Janet?
Sorry, everybody, I was muted. There's a second question here. What are some interesting circular business models you're seeing working in New Zealand? Are there good examples from startups that are demonstrating a healthier, more circular and more equitable approach to food systems? And that's from Paloma. And I guess, Jane, I know there is a lot of interest amongst Māori for starting up food businesses that are based on producing good organic food and distributing in a better way. But I have to say, one of the really hard things here in New Zealand is land is so expensive, and getting a business started is so expensive. So there are pockets of people, and there are pockets of people doing organics, and there are pockets of people factoring environmental concerns into their bottom lines. But it's quite difficult when you're competing with people who don't, you know, it's the usual age-old thing with any business. Those people who are taking whatever shortcuts they can take to make things more cheaply will get ahead in the business. And if you're trying to do things properly and having a more equitable, a more environmentally focused approach, then your product will cost more, and then you have to niche market only to those people who can afford it. So that's a problem everywhere. There are some very good organics companies in New Zealand, and there are people starting to do this. There was an opportunity for Māori to have a lot to do with the Manuka honey industry. That's been taken over by a big corporate, so that's unfortunate. But Jane, wouldn't you say we're back to the same problem? Is it costs more to produce environmentally friendly and good products, good food products, and so that tends to keep them off the shelves and just operating under the radar, and that's a problem everywhere. But people are thinking about it a lot, and I think that that's a positive sign.
I think so too, Janet. And when you come back to this circular business models and startups, really, I'm not underlining the pessimistic angle of how Māoris are supposed to advance. I'm just giving you factual evidence of what's happening. Now, an example of things being incorrectly instigated, starting from the government, was about 2 years ago, one of our members of parliament was issued with the task of allocating $3 billion to any good example of business models that he could come across, whether it was Māori or otherwise, but it was aimed towards trying to establish businesses for Māoridom. Now, this gentleman decided off his own bat that planting pine trees would be a really good start because it would give unlimited occupations to unemployed youth Māori. Never mind about what the pine trees were going to do and devastate the land and soak up all the water around it and destroy the waterways. He was advertising, putting out this money, hundreds and thousands of dollars worth of it, tempting everybody to grow pine trees. It even went down to the South Island of New Zealand, into areas that had never had mass plantings of that nature. Almost as bad as taking dairy farming down into some of our pristine, beautiful landscapes down there. And he had the control of the purse strings. So what does he do in order to supposedly help unemployed Māori in the far north who are really at poverty level? He goes and passes on this information. He wants to set up a museum costing millions of dollars in a poor area of the west coast of the north side and dedicate the museum to our old Kupe ancestor who discovered New Zealand. And instead of having small startup businesses like Janet was talking about, he's aiming to drag tourists in by paying millions of dollars that could have started off about 20 small businesses into being self-dependent. But no, it's a done deal. He signed off on a museum, a building that only tourists will get to use, and it doesn't solve food problems or business models. Now, when you have directions coming down from your government, participated in by your Māori patriarchal people, They're just carrying over insult into injury by carrying on the legacy of patriarchy, and it's make money at whatever cost, never mind about anything else. It's destruction being perpetrated, now taken up by these Māori patriarchal people, loading up their own pockets with money that could be better used by these startups that you asked, Paloma. It doesn't cost much to start up a family in whether it's making remedies of health reasons. Hundreds of people have wanted to start making Māori roa, Māori medicines, because they're really quite popular in New Zealand now because they're efficacious. And what do? We end up with a huge building that's signed off that only tourists are going to walk through. And it's making more of a build-up in an area that's deprived for cars and people who just float through your community and come to look at a building. So, you know, Paloma, it's a question that you can't even start startups because the money that's handed out doesn't meet the people. It actually meets locations of businesses that are already decrepit. So thank you for your question, Paloma.
Wow. Thank you, Jane and Janet. Wow. As a young person who's been so inspired in every conversation that I have had with you, I'd like to take the privilege of asking a final question for some closing thoughts. And I thought a great final question is, how can we invite more intergenerational activism?
Are you addressing me or Janet?
Both.
All right. If you don't mind, Janet, I'll just use it from my point of view. Intergenerational to me is my mother, myself, my daughter, my grandchildren. And we are well established in that intergenerational awareness. We know community. Absolutely, you require community in order for intergenerationals to survive. And Janet's story regarding our children being taken tears apart the generation that should exist at that level. And how can we inspire it? You really have to take responsibility for your next generation. If you don't take responsibility for it, and then that generation takes responsibility and picks it up and carries it of their own choice, not by your pressure, but in the walk you're doing, demonstrates to your next generation, this is really required and I have to do this so that the next generation carries on. And I had very good teachers, Lauren. My mother was a very, very beautiful person. And she made me aware that other people mattered. And that's intergenerational for me, starts with you and me and Tanya and Janet and everybody who's listening now. It starts with you if you don't want to lose your generations. And that's really why our ancestral lineage is so important and we hang on to it. Because without it, we've got nothing to give to the next generation. If you, Lauren, walk 10 miles down the road, your children don't have to walk those 10. They can invent 10 new miles for their children. So whatever opposition you run into, your child will not have to run into that opposition because you've been there, you have the experience, you download it to the intergenerational and they carry it right through and don't have to walk through your footsteps. and their footsteps will hold value for the next footsteps. Thank you.
Lauren, I'd like to answer that by talking about my two children. So I have two lovely children. They are 13 and 10. And I've kept them away from television and from phones and from games. So I think it's really guarding your mind, because what we have, I think, is a poverty of spirit and a poverty of independence, really. And you see a lot of people, they're just so engrossed, or their minds are full of all these things that can be bought and all these things, and all of those things are so unnecessary. You don't need them, right? But people have been, they've been persuaded, their minds have been taken over by this idea that you can be more efficient, you can be this, you can be that. And when you step away from all of that and you focus on your life and the people around you, and things like, you know, the sanctity of food and love and all of those things, you know, all of us as humans, we're very simple. And it wasn't until I had children, and I had children late in life, that I realized that actually our needs are very simple. We're just like little babies. We just need some sleep. We need some good food. We need people around us who love us. And we need to be doing meaningful things and meaningful work, right? And there's just so much spent on this quest for meaning. And when you just put that away and you say, actually, this is really quite simple. This is what I need. And that's it. I don't want to know about all those other things. I think that that's really the answer. And then going back to, you know, I think it's really wonderful what you've done here. I'd never really thought about the sovereignty of food. I'd just gone about doing some things that looked a bit like that. But I think these sorts of initiatives that you have been running and inviting us on here has been great. And wherever I go, because I was brought up in a time where being an activist was a very lonely business, you know, being a feminist was a very lonely business. And now I see all these young people and they're out there talking about this and protesting. And I always say that's so wonderful, you know, for people like me, because it was very lonely in the old days. We were branded as this and that, and, you know, despised in some ways. So that's really great to see. But I think it's about keeping your mind clean and tidy and not littered with distractions. That's the important part. So thank you.
Thank you for that, Janet, and thank you, Jane. Wow. Please follow and support today's speakers. So much gratitude and love to the both of you and to the Grandmothers Council. I can't wait to be within arm's reach. I'm so ready for that. And please, everyone, go follow Fog Moon Studio and tune in next week. We have an amazing session coming up, Solidarity and Emergency Land Reform. This will be with MST in Brazil, Movimento Sem Terra, the Landless Workers Movement. This is going to be an incredible broadcast from one of the most influential groups for land reform in Brazil. Everyone, thank you. Support the broadcast if you can. Go to growingculture.org to follow up for updates. Go to donate, as well as thank you to our sponsors, Pilgrim and Dascom and Eat Your Way Clean. Jane and Janet, as we wrap up here, if there's any last words of wisdom, because there's been no shortage of wisdom today, I want to give up the floor and allow you guys to take the end.
Jane, okay. I mean, the only thing that I can say to everybody listening is thank you, and cultivate your independence and your heart, and trust in yourself, trust in your judgments about what's good for you, and take that control back. You were born for a reason, make it happen.
And I really want to thank you, Lauren. You know that I have huge love for you. And this opportunity to reach out to all the wonderful people who will listen to this session. I thank you for that. And I offer to everybody a gentleness of spirit, an absolute steel in your mind to have what's yours and not anybody else's, just yours, and to hold and not allow it to be taken by others, but to do it with a great deal of appreciation that love does work. And Wairua, which is spirit, has an undying source of help for you. Thank you again, dear boy.
Thank you. Thank you. And I know it's Saturday morning for you all, Friday evening for folks listening in the United States. So to everyone, good morning, good evening, good day. Tune in next week, and so much love and gratitude to the both of you. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you.